Some heroes wear capes, others carry weapons. But on a cold September morning in 1976, one hero simply stopped running. Shavarsh Karapetyan and his brother Kamo had just completed their daily 12-mile training run along the shore of Yerevan Lake when metal screamed against concrete. A trolleybus careened through the bridge guardrail, plunging into dark water 30 feet below. The vehicle sank immediately, disappearing beneath the surface with its passengers trapped inside. Shavarsh had perhaps 20 seconds to make a choice: continue jogging home to breakfast and a hot shower, or dive into freezing water after a bus he couldn't see, to save people he didn't know, using lungs already burning from 12 miles of running. The water was cold. The visibility would be zero. The passengers were drowning. He dove anyway. What followed would save 20 lives and destroy his own. The Soviet Union built champions with the same methodical precision it built tractors and missiles. In the mountain city of Yerevan, Armenia, young Shavarsh Karapetyan learned early that excellence demanded sacrifice. Born May 19, 1953, to a working-class family, he discovered swimming in the cold pools fed by mountain streams. Water so frigid it taught the body to adapt or quit. Finswimming found Shavarsh as a teenager, or perhaps he found it. The sport combined swimming with a monofin, a single blade worn on both feet that transformed swimmers into something resembling human dolphins. In Soviet athletics programs, finswimming existed as both sport and military training, developing underwater capabilities that could serve dual purposes. Shavarsh showed immediate aptitude. His lungs seemed larger than other boys', his comfort in cold water absolute, his determination unshakable. Coach Lipik Javorkovich Hofhanessian recognized something beyond talent in the teenage Shavarsh. While other swimmers trained hard, Shavarsh trained obsessively. While others rested between sets, Shavarsh added extra laps. His brother Kamo became his training partner, the two of them pushing each other through punishing workouts that built not just muscle and lung capacity, but an iron will. The training regimen would have broken most athletes. Hours underwater, holding breath until the body screamed for air, then holding longer. Swimming in winter lakes until cold water became familiar as room temperature. Developing the ability to navigate by touch in zero visibility. Finding objects on lake bottoms in complete darkness. Building mental toughness to override the panic response when lungs burned and vision narrowed. By his early 20s, Shavarsh had accumulated 11 world records in finswimming. The provincial kid from Yerevan had become a Soviet champion, his name appearing in sports newspapers alongside cosmonauts and chess masters. His lung capacity measured 3 times that of an average man. He could hold his breath for over 3 minutes. His resting heart rate dropped so low that doctors initially suspected measurement errors. The 16th of September, 1976, began as an ordinary training day. Shavarsh was 23 years old, at the absolute peak of his athletic powers, his body a precisely calibrated instrument of speed and endurance. The 12-mile run along Yerevan Lake was routine maintenance, keeping cardiovascular fitness sharp between swimming sessions. He had no way of knowing that every hour spent training underwater, every moment spent building cold tolerance and breath control, had been preparing him for something far more important than breaking records. The human body was not designed for diving into freezing lakes to rescue trapped passengers from submerged buses. Every instinct, every autonomic response, every survival mechanism evolved over millennia screams against such actions. Understanding why Shavarsh Karapetyan could do what most people cannot requires understanding how championship training had fundamentally rewired his physiology. Finswimming created physiological adaptations that bordered on superhuman. The mammalian dive reflex, present in all humans, but dramatically enhanced in trained divers, triggers when cold water touches the face. Heart rate drops immediately, blood vessels constrict in extremities, oxygen consumption decreases, and blood flow redirects to vital organs. In average people, this reflex provides modest protection. In Shavarsh, years of training had amplified these responses to extraordinary levels. His breath-holding capacity resulted from both genetic gifts and relentless conditioning. while untrained people begin experiencing desperate air hunger after 45 seconds underwater. Shavarsh regularly trained at 3-minute breath holds, pushing his body to function efficiently on minimal oxygen. His lungs had expanded beyond normal capacity. His blood carried elevated hemoglobin levels, and his muscles had developed enhanced tolerance for lactic acid buildup that causes burning fatigue. Cold water kills quickly through multiple mechanisms. Hypothermia shuts down mental function within minutes. The cold shock response causes involuntary gasping, often leading to drowning. Muscle function deteriorates rapidly, making swimming increasingly difficult. Yerevan Lake in September measured perhaps 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to incapacitate most swimmers within 15 minutes. Shavarsh's training in mountain lakes had conditioned his body to function in cold that would paralyze others. The physics of underwater rescue present challenges that training cannot fully overcome. Submerged at 30 feet, the trolleybus sat in near total darkness. Silt and debris churned by the crash created zero visibility. Water pressure at that depth, while not extreme, adds resistance to every movement. The bus itself became a maze of metal, sharp edges, and confined spaces where disorientation meant death. Most drowning victims of underwater accidents die not from lack of rescue attempts, but because rescuers drown attempting impossible saves. Swimming to depth requires oxygen. Finding victims requires time. Bringing them to surface requires strength. Each factor depletes resources the rescuer needs to survive. The mathematics are brutal. Most would-be heroes die alongside those they attempt to save. Shavarsh possessed physical capabilities that gave him a chance where others had none. But capability alone does not explain what happened that morning. The mental conditioning to override every survival instinct, to dive repeatedly into darkness, while the body screams for oxygen and warmth, to touch death 20 times, and keep reaching into it, requires something that no training regimen can fully instill. The trolleybus plunged into Yerevan Lake at approximately 8:47 a.m. on the 16th of September, 1976. Route number 2 ran from the city center through residential neighborhoods, carrying workers to factories and children to schools. The driver, whose name would be lost in subsequent Soviet censorship of the incident, apparently suffered a mechanical failure or momentary loss of control near the Halabian Street Bridge. The guardrail offered little resistance to several tons of metal and momentum. Shavarsh and Camo heard the crash from perhaps 200 meters away. The sound of metal tearing, then the enormous splash. Other witnesses stood frozen or ran toward telephones to summon help that would arrive too late. Shavarsh ran toward the water, his brother following. No discussion, no debate, no calculation of odds. They reached the shore as the last air bubbles broke the surface. The first dive took Shavarsh into water that shocked his system despite years of cold conditioning. 30 feet down through murky water, arms outstretched, hands searching for metal in absolute darkness. His fingers found the bus roof, then traced along the frame searching for an opening. The rear window, his hands located the emergency exit already partially broken by the impact. He smashed through the remaining glass, cutting his palms and pulled himself inside. The interior of the bus was hell-rendered in water and darkness. Bodies floated, some moving weakly, others still. Shavarsh's hands found a passenger gripped clothing pulled. The weight was enormous, waterlogged fabric and deadweight limbs. His lungs already burned from the dive, 12 miles of running, having depleted his oxygen reserves before this began. He kicked toward dim light, dragging his burden upward, breaking the surface after what felt like hours but measured perhaps 90 seconds. Camo pulled the passenger to shore. Shavarsh sucked air into screaming lungs. Then dove again. The second dive found the bus more quickly, but the interior had grown more chaotic. For nearly a week, Shavarsh remained in critical condition, his athletic conditioning paradoxically both saving his life and having pushed him far past normal human limits. The irony was not lost on his doctors. This young man had saved 20 lives, but in doing so had nearly ended his own. His lungs, those magnificent organs that had carried him to world records and enabled him to hold his breath longer than almost any human alive, were now permanently damaged. Scar tissue was forming, reducing capacity, limiting function. The prognosis was clear: Shavarsh Karapetyan would never compete as an athlete again. Soviet sports officials visited the hospital with expressions of concern that masked bureaucratic complexity. This was 1976, deep in the Cold War era, when the Soviet Union carefully controlled information flow. A story of dramatic heroism could be powerful propaganda, but uncontrolled narratives were dangerous. The decision came swiftly: the incident would not be publicized. No newspapers, no television coverage, no public recognition. The champion who had saved 20 lives would remain officially unknown. Shavarsh's family maintained vigil through weeks of recovery. His brother Kamo carried particular weight, having witnessed every dive, having been unable to stop his brother from diving that final, nearly fatal time. Gratitude for the lives saved mixed with guilt over being unable to prevent the permanent damage to Shavarsh's body and career. Their parents watched their son struggle to breathe normally, knowing that the powerful lungs that had been his gift were now scarred and limited. Recovery lasted months. Shavarsh had to relearn breathing patterns that wouldn't trigger coughing fits. Simple walks left him winded. The 12-mile training runs that had once been routine now existed only as memory. His world records would stand, monuments to capabilities he no longer possessed. At 23 years old, an age when most athletes are entering their prime, Shavarsh Karapetyan's career was over. The psychological adjustment proved as difficult as the physical rehabilitation. For years, his identity had been that of champion swimmer, Soviet athlete, record holder. Now he was a former athlete with damaged lungs and a rescue story he was forbidden to tell publicly. The quiet mourning for his lost career proceeded without public sympathy, without recognition that his sacrifice had been anything unusual. He had saved 20 people and in return received permanent disability and official silence. 20 people emerged from Yerevan Lake that September morning because Shavarsh Karapetyan refused to stop diving. Their stories reveal the profound arithmetic of partial rescue, where gratitude and grief occupy the same space, where survival carries the weight of those who did not survive. 7-year-old Armin Gevorkian was pulled from the bus on Shavarsh's 6th or 7th dive, the count lost in chaos and oxygen deprivation. His mother Nareen learned that her son lived while other children on that bus had died. The gratitude she felt was absolute and complicated by survivors' guilt that would persist for decades. Why had her child been saved when others were lost? The randomness of which passenger Shavarsh's hands found first in the darkness became the difference between life and death. Lilit Markosayan was 19 weeks pregnant when the bus crashed through the guardrail. She survived Shavarsh's rescue, delivered a healthy son 2 months later, and named him Shavarsh in honor of the man who had saved 2 lives with 1 dive. But she never fully recovered from the trauma of drowning, the sensation of water filling her lungs, the certainty of death before strong hands pulled her upward. Her son would grow up healthy and strong, a life that nearly ended before beginning, but his mother would flinch at the sight of buses for the rest of her life. Elderly passengers who survived carried their own complex emotions. They had lived full lives, raised families, and were approaching their final years when a stranger dove repeatedly into freezing darkness to give them more time. Some felt profound gratitude. Others wrestled with the question of whether their rescue had been worth the permanent damage inflicted on a 23-year-old champion in his prime. These were not questions with comfortable answers. The bus driver survived, pulled from the wreckage by Shavarsh's determined hands. He would carry the weight of the accident for the remainder of his life, the mechanical failure or momentary lapse that sent his bus into the lake, the screams of passengers as water rushed in, the miracle of his own survival when he perhaps deserved death more than the innocent passengers. Survivor's guilt has its own arithmetic, irrational but persistent. But not all stories ended with survival. Shavarsh made 20 dives and pulled 20 people from the submerged bus. The trolleybus held capacity for more than 30 passengers. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. Some passengers remained in the bus, trapped in darkness, drowning while Shavarsh fought to save those he could reach. Those deaths haunted him more than the rescues comforted him. Families who lost loved ones despite Shavarsh's efforts faced complicated emotions. Gratitude that someone had tried so desperately to save their mothers, husbands, children, grief that those efforts had been insufficient. Some attended funeral services where they saw the exhausted, guilt-ridden young man who had nearly died trying to save their family members. Some blamed him irrationally for not diving more, not finding their loved one in time, not being superhuman enough to save everyone. Soviet censorship meant that many survivors did not learn their rescuer's identity for years. They lived with knowledge that someone had saved them, but not who that someone was. Anonymous heroism denied them even the ability to express gratitude. When Shavarsh's story eventually became public in the late 1980s during Glasnost, some survivors learned for the first time the name and face of the man who had given them life. The weight Shavarsh carried was different from gratitude. He remembered each dive into darkness, each body his hands touched, each passenger he couldn't save. His damaged lungs became a permanent reminder, not of the 20 he rescued, but of the others who remained in the bus. In quiet moments, he would later admit, he thought more about those he failed to reach than those he brought to light. Heroes, he would learn, carry the burden of incomplete victory more heavily than others carry the weight of total defeat. Decades later, survivors and their families would seek him out for reunions. Children he had saved grew to adulthood, married, had children of their own. Grandchildren exist because one man refused to stop diving. But in meeting these families, Shavarsh also met the absences. The relatives who should have been present but weren't, the empty chairs at family gatherings. His rescue had created life and preserved loss in equal measure. The complexity of partial salvation became his permanent companion. 9 years passed between the trolleybus rescue and the day Shavarsh Karapetyan proved that the 16th of September 1976 was not an isolated moment of courage, but rather a window into fundamental character. The 19th of February 1985 began ordinarily enough. Shavarsh had rebuilt a life after his swimming career ended. He worked as a cobbler and coached youth sports, finding purpose in passing skills to the next generation. His lungs still troubled him, breathing remained difficult, but he had adapted. The 12-mile training runs were gone, but he still jogged shorter distances to maintain fitness. His route that winter morning took him through central Yerevan, past buildings familiar from years of training runs. The sports hall on Abavian Street had been part of his old training complex, a place where he had once been champion, now just another building on his modest jog. Smoke pouring from broken windows changed everything. Fire had broken out inside the sports hall, trapping people in the building. Flames and smoke were visible through the windows. People were screaming. The instinct that drove most humans to flee from fire drove Shavarsh toward it. His damaged lungs, still scarred from sewage water and oxygen deprivation, made him particularly vulnerable to smoke inhalation. He ran into the building anyway. Witnesses later described what followed with a mixture of awe and horror. Shavarsh smashed through windows to create escape routes, his hands slicing on broken glass. He entered smoke-filled rooms where visibility approached the zero he had experienced underwater 9 years earlier. He found people disoriented by smoke, grabbed them, dragged them toward fresh air. Again and again he returned to the building, each entry more dangerous as the fire intensified, and his compromised lungs filled with toxic smoke. The burns he suffered were severe, particularly on his hands and arms. More seriously, his lungs, already damaged and functioning at reduced capacity, took additional permanent damage from smoke inhalation. By the time other rescuers arrived and physically prevented Shavarsh from entering the burning building again, he had pulled several people to safety and was collapsing from smoke poisoning. Another ambulance, another hospital, another near-death experience. His family's worst fears realized, here we go again. The pattern was undeniable. This was not one moment of extraordinary courage driven by adrenaline or circumstance. This was who Shavarsh Karapetyan was at his core. Some people can walk past suffering. Some people calculate the personal risk and make rational decisions about involvement. Shavarsh seemed constitutionally incapable of doing either. When he encountered people in mortal danger, his response was automatic and self-destructive. He ran toward disaster while others ran away. Psychologists studying heroic behavior identify a category of individuals whose empathy and sense of responsibility override self-preservation instincts. These people cannot not help, even when helping destroys them. Shavarsh fit this profile perfectly. His wife, whom he had married in the years between rescues, now faced the reality of loving someone who would risk everything for strangers. Her terror, as he lay in another hospital bed, fighting for life, was profound and complicated by the knowledge that this was who she had married, and who he would always be. Soviet authorities, having suppressed the trolleybus rescue story for 9 years, found the fire rescue impossible to ignore. Public witnesses, media presence, and the dramatic nature of the rescue forced their hand. Recognition finally came, the Order of the Badge of Honor, public acknowledgement of his heroism, his story spreading through newspapers. The authorities even retroactively acknowledged the 1976 rescue, nearly a decade of enforced silence finally ending. Shavarsh's response to belated recognition remained characteristically modest. He expressed no bitterness about the years of official silence. He downplayed both rescues as simply doing what needed to be done. The discomfort with celebrity evident in 1985 would only intensify in subsequent years as his legend grew. But what the second rescue proved was more important than any award. The 16th of September, 1976, was not an aberration. Shavarsh Karapetyan was a man who dove into darkness because people were drowning, whether that darkness was water or smoke. The permanent damage to his body was simply the price of being who he was. The late 1985 brought glasnost, Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of openness that lifted Soviet censorship and allowed stories like Shavarsh Karapetyan's to spread freely. What had been suppressed for nearly a decade suddenly became public inspiration. The man who had twice nearly died saving strangers became a Soviet hero, his story appearing in newspapers, magazines, and television programs across the USSR. Recognition that should have come in 1976 arrived in a flood. Awards followed in succession. The Order of the Red Banner of Labor, one of the Soviet Union's highest civilian honors, named Honored Master of Sports of the USSR, recognizing both his athletic achievements and his heroic actions. UNESCO acknowledged his humanitarian contribution. He met Gorbachev himself, the Soviet leader praising Shavarsh as an example of the best qualities of Soviet citizenship. Documentaries were produced, examining his rescues in detail that made Shavarsh visibly uncomfortable. His response to fame remained consistent with his character. In interviews, he repeated variations of the same message. "I don't consider myself a hero, I was just doing what anyone should do." But the evidence contradicted his modesty. Anyone could have dove into Yerevan Lake that September morning. Anyone could have entered the burning building 9 years later. Hundreds witnessed both events. Only Shavarsh acted. His insistence that his actions were ordinary made him even more compelling to a public hungry for moral examples. The burden of being held as a moral standard proved heavier than the physical damage to his lungs. People expected him to embody heroism in every aspect of life, to be consistently noble and self-sacrificing. Strangers approached him in public, wanting to touch someone who had accomplished the impossible. Families of survivors sought him out, expressing gratitude that, while genuine, became overwhelming in its intensity. He had saved lives, but in doing so had lost some measure of privacy and normal existence. His brother Kamo offered unique perspective on living in proximity to heroism. He had been there for both rescues, had witnessed Shavarsh's self-destructive courage firsthand, had been unable to stop his brother from diving the 20th time or entering the burning building that final time. Kamo carried his own complex emotions, pride in his brother's character, grief over the permanent damage, frustration at Shavarsh's inability to prioritize his own survival. Being the brother of a hero came with its own burdens. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought new challenges. Armenia gained independence but faced economic chaos, political instability, and war with Azerbaijan. The 1988 earthquake that killed tens of thousands had devastated the country just 3 years earlier. In this context, Shavarsh's role evolved from celebrated hero to community anchor. He used his platform reluctantly but effectively to help others, advocating for survivors of the earthquake, supporting youth sports programs, representing Armenian interests in the chaotic post-Soviet period. Emotional reunions with survivors continued through the decades. Children he had pulled from the bus were now adults with families of their own. Armen Gevorkyan, saved at age 7, introduced Shavarsh to his own children, grandchildren who existed because of those dives into darkness. Lilit Markosyan's son Shavarsh, now grown, met his namesake and expressed gratitude for the gift of life. These encounters moved Shavarsh more than any official recognition, putting faces and names to the abstract concept of lives saved. The mathematical calculation of his true impact became impossible to complete. 20 people saved directly, but how many children born to those survivors? How many grandchildren? How many lives touched by those who would not exist without the 16th of September, 1976? The ripples spread through time and generations, an exponential impact that defied precise measurement. Conservative estimates suggested hundreds of lives existed because of his actions, perhaps thousands when extended family were considered. Shavarsh eventually moved to Moscow, seeking some distance from the intensity of being a legend in his homeland. He worked in business, lived quietly, and avoided the spotlight when possible. But the permanent reminder of his choices accompanied him everywhere. Every breath was difficult, his damaged lungs making simple activities challenging. Some days he could barely walk without becoming winded. The price of heroism was not metaphorical or temporary. It was literal, permanent, and paid with every labored breath for the rest of his life. His reflections on heroism grew more nuanced over the years. He acknowledged that courage was complicated, costly, and not always glamorous. The Hollywood version of heroism showed people saving lives and walking away to cheering crowds. The reality involved permanent disability, psychological trauma, and the haunting memory of those you couldn't save. Yet when asked if he would do it again, knowing the cost, his answer never wavered. Yes, always yes. Some things were worth any price. The decades passed, and Shavarsh Karapetyan settled into a life that balanced his past with his present. Moscow became home, his business pursuits providing comfortable living without demanding the spotlight. His lungs remained compromised, breathing growing more difficult with age, but he adapted with the same pragmatic determination that had characterized his athletic career and his heroic rescues. The young champion was now an older man, his body bearing permanent scars of choices made 40 years earlier. Community service continued, though less dramatically than trolleybus rescues or running into burning buildings. He trained young athletes, teaching swimming and finswimming techniques to a new generation. His coaching philosophy emphasized not just physical technique but character development. He spoke to students about responsibility, courage, and the importance of acting when action was needed. The lessons were subtle, rarely referencing his own experiences directly, but students understood they were learning from someone who had lived the principles he taught. Interviews came periodically, particularly around anniversaries of the rescues. The 30th anniversary in 2006 brought renewed international attention. Documentaries were updated, articles written, his story shared with audiences too young to remember the Soviet era. The 40th anniversary in 2016 sparked similar interest, his actions examined by a new generation, seeking examples of human goodness in an increasingly cynical age. Shavarsh participated reluctantly but thoughtfully, using the platform to emphasize themes he believed important. His message remained consistent across decades. Ordinary people are capable of extraordinary action. The hero worship made him uncomfortable because he insisted he was not special, not gifted with unusual courage, simply someone who made choices when choices were necessary. He criticized celebrity culture that elevated fame over substance, that celebrated people for being famous rather than for doing meaningful work. His actions, he maintained, should be normal, not exceptional. The fact that they seemed exceptional said more about society's lowered expectations than about his elevated character. Return visits to Armenia grew more frequent in his later years. A memorial at Yerevan Lake marked the spot where the trolleybus had crashed through the guardrail. Shavarsh would stand there, looking at water that no longer seemed particularly cold or dark to eyes that had seen colder, darker places. He remembered the weight of waterlogged passengers, the burning in his lungs, the desperate race against time and physics. He remembered those he saved and those he couldn't reach. The memories remained vivid after 40 years. Health challenges intensified with age. The lung damage from 1976 and 1985 never healed, only worsened gradually. Simple activities became difficult. Walking distances required rest stops. Breathing required conscious effort. Doctors marveled that he remained alive given the extent of scarring and reduced capacity. His athletic training and conditioning, they speculated, had given him reserves that kept him functioning decades past what would have killed others with similar damage. When asked if he would do it again, knowing the full cost, Shavarsh's answer never changed. Yes, always yes. The damaged lungs, the ended career, the permanent disability, the decades of difficult breathing, all of it was acceptable. 20 people lived because he dove. More people survived the fire because he entered the smoke. The price was high, but the alternative, walking past suffering, choosing comfort over conscience, was unthinkable to him. This was who he was. The transformation from athlete to hero to elder statesman completed gradually. By his 70s, Shavarsh represented something larger than his individual actions. His name had become synonymous with selfless courage in Armenia and beyond. Children learned his story in schools alongside national heroes from centuries past. His legend inspired others to act, when confronted with opportunities to help, creating ripples of positive action that extended far beyond the 20 people he pulled from darkness. The final dive was not into water or fire, but into the ongoing work of using his platform for good. He spoke on behalf of Armenian causes, advocated for refugees displaced by regional conflicts, promoted youth sports development, and lent his name to humanitarian initiatives. The physical dives had ended decades earlier, but the pattern of service continued uninterrupted. Shavarsh Karapetyan, at 71, remained who he had been at 23. Someone who could not walk past suffering, someone whose sense of responsibility extended to strangers he would never meet. His legacy was not just in the lives saved, but in the inspiration provided to others. Young Armenians pointed to Shavarsh as proof that one person could make a difference, that ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances could rise to meet them. Athletes understood that physical gifts carried responsibility to serve others. His story became a teaching tool, a reminder that character mattered more than capability, that moral courage deserved recognition alongside physical prowess. In 2025, Shavarsh Karapetyan lives quietly in Moscow, his damaged lungs making each breath a reminder and a testament. He is 71 years old, his body bearing the permanent scars of his choices. The swimmer who kept diving into darkness has become an elder statesman of moral courage. His legacy secure not in monuments or awards, but in the hundreds of lives that exist because he refused to walk past suffering when it would have been so easy to keep jogging home that September morning. Shavarsh Karapetyan's story reveals something fundamental about the distance between capability and choice. Many people could swim in September 1976. Only one dove into darkness. The difference was not training but character. The cost of heroism proved real and permanent. His career ended at 23, his lungs damaged beyond repair, each breath a reminder paid across 5 decades. Yet when asked if the price was too high, his answer never wavered: some things are worth any cost. The 20 dives became metaphor for moral courage itself. Doing the right thing once is admirable. Doing it repeatedly, even as it destroys you, defines who you are. Shavarsh could not walk past suffering, whether drowning in water or trapped in fire. This was not occasional heroism, but essential nature. His insistence that anyone would have done the same challenges our comfortable excuses. Most people freeze, flee, or rationalize inaction. His example strips away these fictions, forcing recognition that heroism is choice. 20 people saved directly, but their descendants number in the hundreds. The ripples spread through generations, impossible to track fully but undeniably real. One man's refusal to walk past suffering created expanding circles of life. His legacy lives in Armenia, where children learn his story alongside ancient heroes. But his greater legacy is the question his life poses to each of us. When the water is cold and dark and someone is drowning, what will you choose?